In this movie, I'll introduce you to the histogram. And while it may initially seem rather technical, I consider this an essential feature because it gives you a method for gauging the quality of your luminance levels other than just eyeballing it. So to get to the histogram, go up to the window menu and choose histogram, and that'll bring up this colorful, if confusing, little panel here. Next, what I want you to do is click on the fly up menu icon in the upper right corner of the panel and choose expanded view. And then, to make things ever so slightly less confusing, switch the channel from colors to luminosity. And then you'll see a single white histogram like so. At which point you may think, well, gosh, what in the world good could this possibly do me? Well, before we can use the histogram, we have to understand how it works. So I'm going to go ahead and hide the panel for now. And I'll switch over to this diagram that I've created in advance. And imagine that this is just a typical histogram. It's not the one that we were looking at just a moment ago. But like any histogram, it represents a bar graph of all the luminance levels inside the image. So by way of background, most images are what are known as 8-bit per channel images, meaning that you have 2 to the 8th power, or 256 luminance levels per channel, red, green, and blue. And that's what we're seeing right here. If you were to count every single possible little bar graph, you would count 236 in all, starting with black over on the far left side and ending with white on the far right side. And so what we're seeing here is a kind of popularity contest. So anytime you see a big tall bar, that tells you that there are a lot of pixels in the image colored with that specific luminance level. Now, it doesn't tell you where those pixels are located inside the image. It just tells you they exist. And so your shadows are going to be roughly over here in the first third of the histogram. Your highlights, your bright colors, are going to be over here in the last third. And your midtones are going to be right there in the center. And again, there's no firm boundaries between shadows and midtones or midtones and highlights. These are just general ranges of luminosity inside of a digital photograph. Now, by way of a little technical detail, the number assigned to black is 0, and then the next darkest color is 1, and then 2, and then 3, and so on, all the way up to 255 for white. And you may wonder, well, how in the world does that work? In what universe do you add 0 to 255 in order to get a total of 256 luminance levels across the entire graph? And the way it works is we have luminance levels 1 right next to black through 255, and then we add in one more for black, which just happens to have a value of 0. So again, 255 luminance levels in all. Now, when you're using a histogram to gauge the quality of the luminance levels inside of your image, you want to take a look at how that histogram, the sort of mountainous histogram here, fits inside of its container. So what you don't want to see are big spikes right at the beginning or at the end of the histogram, because that's going to represent clipping inside the image. So if you have a big spike right here at black, that means you have a ton of black pixels. And if you have a big spike over here on white, that means you have a ton of white pixels, which tells you either the image is too bright if there's a bunch of white, it's too dark if there's a bunch of black, or it has too much contrast if it has spikes on either side. What you want to see is what we're seeing right here, which is a gradual incline in the shadow region, and then a bunch of mountainous activity in the midtones, and then finally a gradual decline into white. If you have super tall highlights or super tall shadows, that doesn't really matter. That just tells you that the image is balanced towards brightness or darkness, and that becomes a totally subjective determination on your part. So again, what we're looking at is the popularity of the luminance levels inside the image. We want to avoid a bunch of blacks. We want to avoid a bunch of whites. We want the graph to taper in gradually, spike all over the place, and then gradually taper away. And so with that in mind, I'll show you how to make practical use of the histogram in the very next movie.